Welcome to A Brief History Conspiracy.
This week, Atlantis.
If you're new to our channel, please consider hitting a subscription and a like on the video. It really does help. And this week we are 9600 BC in our chronology as we go through conspiracies and mysteries through time in order. Project.
And there's a few other parts of Plato's story that the Richat Structure seems to tie in with well. His story speaks of mountain ranges to the north, which
the
Richat Structure does have a mountainous area to the north with 1,500 foot drops off of the cliff face.
Some of this one must have been dramatic as hell, actually.
So that ties in quite well. And also the sea to the south.
I think you can see, obviously I'll show the images, but you can kind of see that to the south of the structure is sort of a plain, and it looks like there's been water flowing through it. And I think that's the argument they make, isn't it, that if this structure was closer to the ocean, because it is 240 kilometres away from the coast today, you can see that it does open to the south.
Yep.
There's this thing about the white, black and red stone as well, that Plato said it was built from this white, red, black stones, and that does exist in the area. Mostly sort of like a white, creamy coloured stone, but that seems to be another thing that ties in. So then there are a couple of sort of problems with the idea, though, that this could be Atlantis. Plato called it an island, but it's how far from the coast? 250 miles from the coast as today. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels were 100 metres lower than they are now because the water was caught up in the ice. So that would have meant it was even further away. But they sort of argue in Bright Insight that
land masses can lift and sink, possibly by some of the volcanic tectonic activity. That we don't really fully understand all the intricacies of. It's a very complicated global system. So I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility that that part of the world could have risen or sunk.
Yeah, I'm in two minds about it.
Yeah,
he uses the Antarctica example, doesn't he, about how Antarctica is currently raising up by about 1.6 inches a year, and that was partly by volcanic activity potentially. But it's also, they think it's the ice is melting.
Yeah,
it's less weight.
Basically, ice melting. Yeah,
it's like a sponge lifting back up again, isn't it?
Yeah, and exactly that.
Yeah, they argued again that he makes the argument that it wouldn't have to rise by 1.6 inches a year. That over 10,000 years, 1.2 or 1.3 inches, I think, a year would be enough to get to the 13,000 feet above sea level it is today. So this isn't just far away from the ocean, it's actually quite high up as well.
Yeah, 1,300 feet.
1,300 feet, what did I say? 13,000?
13,000. That's quite a high peak.
Just times it by 10.
We're getting up to the highest peaks.
Yeah, I times
13,000.
I times everything by 10, I wouldn't worry about it. But 1,300 feet. So we're still talking, a long way. It's well above sea level today. But we know that earthquakes and things like this can have dramatic impacts on the land.
So I still think it's plausible. It just doesn't seem perhaps as likely.
I think it would need 1-point-something inches a year constantly. And also, if these regions were under the ocean, there would be evidence. There would be... We know that there are land masses that used to be under the ocean because we have fossilised... We see the crustaceans and things like this. We see
fossilised crustaceans in mountains, for example. So we know that at some point
it does happen.
That sediment was laid at the bottom of a river or a sea, and it's risen to the top of a mountain. Yeah. So there is a fluidity to land moving.
That's normally over hundreds of millions of years, and not
thousands of years. The time period is obviously much
That's
greater.
Not enough time to become fossilised for a start. So I mean. But we know it happens, so I don't have a problem with this. There's just no evidence to support it.
Yeah, that's what I'd agree with that.
So at one point he does talk about that there are whale bones found in Mauritania, which is just north of the region we're talking about, isn't it?
No, I think Mauritania just encompasses the whole of the sort of northwestern African countries, of which the Richat Structure
It's part
sits
of.
within.
There used to be an ancient people, the Maori people, didn't
Yeah,
they?
the
You
Maori
lived in
people.
all this area. Now, mainstream science, so this was sort of as put as proof that this region used to be under the ocean. These aren't fossilized bones; they're bones. So we know they're there quite recently. There's quite a few of them, and these skeletons, whale skeletons, and it's 100-mile inland sort of thing. So it is weird. But I googled this and I looked into this, and mainstream science thinks it was the Romans. It was the Roman. It shows that the Roman people were whaling, basically about 1,000 years before we thought they were, and I think that's a more likely. This is something that's been done more recently. People used to do this. They would whale, and they would bring the meat inland to feed people. You'd think it would be butchered at the coast and brought in smaller bits, really, don't you? But apparently that's not what they used to do, because the meat starts rotting as soon as you start cutting into it, I suppose. So they bring it as a carcass.
As a whole carcass in. I suppose, they stretch the resources further. It makes sense.
Yeah. I think that's more likely than that this whole region, because we wouldn't be talking about, if we're not just talking about the Richat Structure rising up 1,300 feet, we're talking about basically the entire west coast of Africa rising up this much. We know Egypt wasn't underwater, so we know that the east coast of Africa was above land. They're talking about the whole continent sort of doing that sort of thing, and that doesn't seem likely to me, not in a 10,000 year period. Or if it did happen, there'd be more evidence.
Not given how central to the equator the centre of Africa's landmass probably is, and the fact that there's no glaciers.
Yeah, no glacial evidence, nothing like that.
Well, there's just no glaciers really, are there, in Africa? There might be some in mountainous regions. I'm not 100% sure. There probably is, but
there aren't a lot of mountainous regions in Africa. Isn't it like Kilimanjaro?
Yeah, I think Ethiopia's
the Atlas Mountains
got some. Well, yeah, the Atlas Mountains is in that the bit Mauritania, isn't it? That's the mountains to the north of the Richat Structure, supposedly, which also brings up another interesting point, doesn't it, about Atlas, who was the king.
Yeah, he's a sort of an ancient. He's sort of like a King Arthur type of figure, from what I can see.
Yeah, for the Maori people, which is interesting that they had a king called Atlas, and there was also in Greek mythology a god called Atlas as well.
Yeah. For this story, Plato said that that basically Atlantis was forged by Poseidon, who was obviously the god of the oceans, and it was given to the people, which is I can understand that what we're talking about, if they discovered this place, that they probably would have thought, like we mentioned earlier, that it was given to them by the gods.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
It does sort of talk about, if we're talking about Plato, this argued that this is an historical account, but obviously a lot of it is talking about how the Poseidon and these sort of things, which is myth. So it's sort of, you have to start wondering what Plato was actually trying to write. But the point is that Poseidon had a son, or a couple of sons, but one of his sons was Atlas, and Atlas was then the first king of
Atlantis. Yeah. It's interesting that there's also another myth about the Maori people having their first king being the king called Atlas as well. And so that does make it tie in very heavily to this region.
And then obviously there's, like we just said, just north of where we're talking about the Richat Structure, there's a mountain region that's the Atlas Mountains. Which is, so the Atlas king was obviously reasonably popular because they named some hills after him.
Yeah.
So I don't think you can start talking about things being actually named, right, and been named them for thousands of years, and it not be based on something.
Yes.
It's got to have been based on something. But this might be 2 or 3 different myths being brought together. Is another way of arguing, I suppose.
It could be, but there does seem to be some similarities between the different myths. One, the local myths of the Maori people, and the other one, a Greek written story told from Egyptian mythology about a lost city, that some evidence it all seems to tie into that region. So it's fascinating for me. I'm not a big believer in coincidence, and that does seem like a huge coincidence for there not to be some kind of actual linking of different people telling the same story slightly differently.
Yeah, exactly. I think that just adds credence to it. There's a nugget of truth to it
Yeah.
when you get different, because we tell stories. Humans tell stories, and things change, and we add bits to it, and we add bits that are, political or at the time or for whatever reason. Very clever people realize a story can be used. Story is power and knowledge and thing. So, but when you get lots of stories that are very similar, you have to start wondering. In our next episode, we're going to be talking about all the other myths and places Atlantis might be. And one of the interesting things is, if you start talking about Irish mythology, it's a lot like the story of Poseidon. They're very similar. And you have to start wondering, I mean, to the point where he had a trident and stuff. I mean, there's these imagery that is very similar to the imagery of Poseidon.
Is this Celtic mythology?
Celtic mythology, yeah. So you've got to start wondering, well, why were people thousands of miles apart telling the same stories? They might have different names for it, but it was the same story.
But there's still some element of truth behind the stories if they're multiple stories confirming
the same
thing. It'd be very unlikely for cultures separated by thousands of miles to have the exact same stories.
But for me,
completely made up, that had no element of truth, and they just happened to stumble upon the exact
come across the same story,
the same myth. They happen to make the same thing up.
No, it seems unlikely.
It seems unlikely to me. Yeah.
So the biggest drawback, or the biggest thing of for me, that this is Atlantis, is the fact that it's so far from the coast. It would have been even further from the coast, possibly back then. And we focus on that. It goes, well, you can't really pick and choose what Plato said, and he said it's an island. So this obviously wasn't an island, and they said also it was destroyed and lost to the sea. I don't think that's necessarily fundamental of this. I don't think that necessarily means this isn't Atlantis, for a couple of reasons. The story was passed down for 6 generations from Solon to Plato, so it might have adjusted. Plato may have changed the story based on other mythology, because we know there were other cities, even in the Mediterranean region, that were lost to the sea. There are sunken cities in the Med.
Yeah, countless ones in the Med, yeah.
So there might have been an element of that as well, that there's maybe different stories. Maybe this was something that was added to by Plato because he knew of cities being lost to the ocean. He knew that would have more impact with the Greek people, because the Greek people knew that, maybe, or something like that.
It could have just served as a warning story for Greek, like I said, for Greek society to not fall down the same path as the lost city of Atlantis.
Or there's another way of looking at it as well, is that Atlantis was an island, but we're maybe not understanding the full example, because with the Richat structure, if you're talking about a wet climate back then, if there was, the other thing is that the river may have been a completely different place. If the water was flowing that way, and you had this large, wide delta, so to say, going towards the ocean.
Yep.
But then in the middle of it, you had these 3 land circles, which would have looked really unnatural to anybody that came past it. That would be an island, but it's not an island in the ocean. It's an island in a flooded region, a delta, a wetland.
That does tie in, actually. I was reading something where they were saying that they do think they've now found evidence under the sand of ancient river beds and river flows from Western Africa, and they think there was possibly another sort of Nile-sized river that ran across there before the desertification.
Yeah, there's lots of us about the Nile running from east to west, isn't there? There's lots of that. It used to flow in a completely different direction than it does now. And when we talk about the Herodotus maps, that shows the Nile flowing in a completely different
direction.
This goes back to Herodotus.
Yes.
So the first time we came up with this thing of calling it the Atlantic Ocean, the first evidence we have of that is Herodotus' map calling it the Atlantic, and in ancient Greek, Atlantic means